Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon and welcome to this debate on putting back finance at the service of the economy. I am Agnès BENASSY-QUÉRÉ. I'm a member of the Cercle des économistes, and I will briefly introduce this debate. The economic crisis we're going through today is radically different from the crisis in 2008. In 2008, we had a crisis that had to do with the debt, and it had started due to indebted U.S. households and European banks. And so today, we're facing a cash flow crisis. In both cases, there was strong support of the government and an increase in public debt. So that's a commonality within the two crises. But today, we also have a marked increase in the debt of non-financial companies. We have 100 billion euros of guaranteed loans backed by the government, granted by banks at the end of March, with a 90% guarantee from the French government. So this means that the bank debt of French corporations has risen by more than 10% in under 10 months. On top of that, we have bond-based debt. You have to add 50 billion over the same period of time. So an increase of 150 billion euros. The guaranteed loan does not need to be reimbursed right now. It should be reimbursed 1 year after the price was concluded, and companies will be able to reimburse it in a period between 1 and 5 years. So the danger is not imminent, but companies must be wondering what was going on, what will happen next. The situation also is based by an increase in cash on hand. Cash on hand has, in parallel, increased by 120 billion. So the net debt has only increased by 30 billion. So we expect that this cash on hand be used to compensate the significant loss incurred by companies. And we should not exclude the possibility of companies to disappear. So we're in a situation with three possibilities. The best case scenario is that the companies that were not too hardly hit by the crisis, they will reimburse their loans. The second case is companies that were already struggling before the crisis, but that's business as usual. There's between 40 and 1,000 companies going bankrupt each year in France. There were very few during the crisis, thanks to government support, but there will be more bankruptcies, so we should not save all the companies. And finally, the most interesting case for us tonight, that's the case of companies that were healthy before the crisis and that were hard hit by the crisis, and that saw their debt level rise to such a level that they will have a hard time reimbursing. So the two problems we're facing today is that we want to avoid the cessation of activity for companies that had a relevant business model that were productive, and the surveys showed that there can be quite a few of them. And second, we want to avoid to have companies to be too restrained in their financing capacity, that they use up all their cash flow to reimburse the loans, and with the consequence that they would have nothing left to invest. So that would be very damaging for future growth. But the central question for our discussion would be, first, how can we avoid too many bankruptcies? And second, for the surviving companies, how can we avoid a deficit of investment? Most people agree that this will require to reinforce equity. How can we do this? We need to do this in efficient way, in a targeted way, because not all companies deserve to be saved, and we need to regenerate the economic fabric. But we want to avoid the excess due to the crisis. So hence the question that it will keep us busy today. How can we put back finance at the service of the economy, but a new model, a greener economy? So now let us hear Bénédicte TASSART, who will introduce our guests. Thank you, Agnès BENASSY-QUÉRÉ, for framing this debate. You're a member of the Cercle des économistes, and I will ask the questions by our listeners. You are welcome to ask your questions at this website, lesrencontreséconomiques.fr/debate. You are attending session 10. So now let us introduce our speakers. Patricia, CRIFO, you are an economist, professor at Ecole Polytechnique. You work on corporate social responsibility and green finance. Philippe, DONNET, you are with us. Can you hear us? You're CEO of Generali, the Italian insurance company. We will, of course, talk about the role of insurance in the pandemic we're going through today. François in the studio. You're Director General of Natixis, a subsidiary of BPCE. You represent the banking sector and savings in this debate. And Benoit LALLEMAND, who will be the troublemaker in our debate. Benoit LALLEMAND, can you hear us? You are Secretary General of Finance Watch, which is a European NGO advocating for more financial regulation at the service of society. You each will have a few minutes to develop a main point, and then we will develop them. And next, we will take questions from the audience. We already have questions by the audience on the website, Patricia Tréfond. This question by Antoine, who asks, how can we make sure that finance is at the service of a greener, more solidary economy? Well, indeed, we need to put socially responsible investment and green finance at the forefront. So what do we mean by socially responsible investment? Investment that both provides economic performance and positive social and environmental impact for sustainable development, no matter the sector. This subject was already very important prominent before the crisis, but it has gained in prominence. France was considered the most dynamic country in the world. To give you a ballpark idea, the sector of asset management, France is the third country in the world in terms of socially responsible investment after the UK and the US. The share of corporate social investment was 1% in 2007. Today, it's 30% of assets under management. So it's a significant amount. What have we observed during the crisis? Companies who were developing responsible practices, both in the social field with, remote working from home, support for child care and so on. These companies are the most resilient companies. They have a very advanced social model, and they also, the companies that were greener showed more resilience. They tend to overperform other companies. So these surveys were done on groups of companies, both in the US, in Europe, and in Asia. So this is quite important result, and it echoes work that I had done previously on large corporations and small companies during the previous crisis, in 2007 crisis. So this is not only due to the current system. Social performance environmental performance, the way stakeholders are taken into account, employees, suppliers, and so on. All of this is a factor that provides more resilience to shock. We're seeing this during crises, and we also observe the same pattern when the situation, the economy is better. You also are saying that French companies have understood very well that socially responsible investment was important to them. Yes, indeed, it's a factor of productivity and of growth. We have significant results in this respect. If we focus on a group of French companies adopting more socially responsible policies towards their clients, their employees, and their suppliers, generate an additional profit of 13%. And it can be even plus 20% in some cases. We're looking at the practices themselves in detail. And I'm not just talking about large corporations, also subcontractors, SMEs, and so on and so forth. These results are very, very striking. Thank you very much. Philippe Donnet, one question on whether the government is paying for the corona pandemic, but what are insurance companies doing? Will insurers invest in equity in the economy? To answer your question, how can we put back finance at the service of the economy? We have first to specify what finance we're talking about and what economy we're talking about. So finance is a very generic term that spans a very, very different universes. The hedge funds, they're speculative, they're considered, but the activity to finance businesses is key to the economy. And there's also the area of asset management that is very large, very diverse. There's the private equity sector that invests in companies' equities, and there's also the insurance sector. Insurance plays a key role in two manners. First, by ensuring the transfer of certain risks from companies, individuals, and households towards companies. So this activity of risk transfer is key for the real economy, as it always has been. Insurers have never ceased to fulfill this initial mission that they have, which is to protect business and economic activity. No risk is possible, no activity is possible, no company could exist without the protection of insurance companies. But the role of insurers is not limited to that. Life insurance is the core business of our group, Generali, and we collect savings, long-term saving. So this means that insurance are long-term investors. And there's quite a bit of savings at this time, so you have a lot to invest. Indeed, yes. Alas, during the lockdown period, the savings collection has increased, but for the wrong reasons. That's because people could not spend their money and consume. But the remarkable thing is that for us, the savings we collect is long-term saving, and that's part of our activity to manage the savings of our clients. So these two legs, insurance and savings management, were always part of our business. But now we're seeing a new trend that's very important. We are increasingly investing due to the low investment, we are increasingly investing in the real economy, the productive economy. That's deep-seated trend that had existed before. That's good news. You are reinvesting in the real economy, but you have a bias towards green finance and solidarity and mutually beneficial projects. Yes, of course, we take that into account more and more. We invest more and more in the real economy. This is what I wanted to say. And by investing in the real economy, clearly we exclusively focus on sustainable economy. I mean by that economy that's both inclusive and green. And there's no other way to go. It's out of the question to do things differently. This crisis, as any crisis, is an opportunity. And this is an opportunity to accelerate our investment in sustainable economy, to accelerate the transition, because the issue is the transition, because disruption would be socially unacceptable and unmanageable. So the issue is to support the transition and to accelerate it. As I was saying, so what do we mean by the real economy? We are increasingly investing in real estate, hence in construction, in infrastructure, as soon as they're considered green. And we increasingly invest in capital equity. We invest increasingly in credit to companies. Recently, Generali took over Sycomore. That's a French company. It's a leader in socially responsible investment and ESGs, because once again, it's out of the question to backtrack and to favor investments that don't go in the right direction. An important thing is that you have to understand it's not just about the economy. We're seeing that this crisis in the real economy, that is not yet a financial crisis, is due to a totally external factor. It's a virus. So there are bridges between the economy and nature, for example. Well, more on this later. You will have a chance to develop this later. Now, let us hand over to François from Natixis. Finance in these exceptional times is moving out of its usual realm. Why did you, there's a question someone asked, why did you call this debate putting finance back at the service of the economy? It already is. I totally agree with this comment, yes. The title of this conference could have been used right after the crisis in 2008-2009, as Agnès pointed out. We're not in the same situation at all. Finance, its very purpose is to serve the economy. If we look at when historically finance started to really develop, and when GDP, when you put that in parallel, well, you see that the development of finance accelerated the growth of the economy. So how can we interpret this question? Well, maybe it's because, well, we have a financial community that is using quantitative data to make decisions. The role of finance is to allocate capital to create as much value as possible. So for that purpose, we use quantitative data. And these quantitative data may be insufficient. Maybe we should increase the qualitative dimension to increase the qualitative dimension of the economy. So I'm going to take two examples that are quite relevant. There's green finance. Should we finance companies that are economically productive but that are polluting? And my other question is, what companies should be saved after the crisis of COVID? The first question is that this question can be simply solved in with a quantitative approach. If governments decided on a price on carbon, and that price, if that price was an international one, we would see that appear or reflected in the quantitative data. We've heard about carbon for years, but it has never been applied since. Yes, indeed, and we're seeing how difficult it is for governments to implement this. When we have things such as the tax on diesel oil, we have the yellow vests. So we are seeing a situation that's a paradox. We are asking financial institutions to do what governments have been unable to do. We're asking, well, some companies are already doing this. Yes, we are. We at Natixis have implemented a bonus malus system in our financing to take into account sustainable ET or lack thereof in the projects, and so we're developing this, and this is a positive development. However, it has to do with the fact that there is no framework. There was no framework implemented by policy, by public policy. The subject question, the second subject is on what companies should be saved. Well, we have a very good example when finance and banks were at the service of society under the guidance of the government. And government did something that is, I found very original and quite a departure from our culture. The government trusted private players to implement their policy. With a 90% guarantee on loans extended by banks. I'm also the chairman of COFAS, and for credit insurance, the government hasn't done the same thing. They implemented a control mechanism, quite bureaucratic, to make sure that credit insurers weren't doing something that went against the government's interest. So the government gave the banks the power to use the 90% guarantee and also the power to say no. And banks are in better positions than governments to determine what companies won't be able to survive, even with the government help. So that's what was done at Natixis, Banque Populaire, and the Caisse d'Épargne. In that case, banks, the government provided guidance or incentives to banks for its public policies, and it worked. If the government wants to use a massive amount of savings that households have accumulated during the lockdown program to help companies, it's going to take a further step, because these savings cannot take the risk. They're not willing to take the risk of investing in small companies. There again, we will need the government to jump in. This is how we can have finance to go beyond its usual prerogative and do not just quantitative but also qualitative. Yes, Benoit, you wanted to say some things about the role of public policy and the environmental targets that we have to take on board.
I think, well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you, because this is a very important discussion to put the finance back at the service of the economy. I don't think we're there yet, but that we can discuss later. But it's also a positive discussion, because after the 2008, 2007, 2008 crisis, what do we do to avoid having finance hurting the system, rather than this question that we've been debating over for several minutes now on the private finance as a transmitter or as a service to the economy. I think there are two phases here, too. We can say that Rome is burning. We see the onset of an economic crisis. There's the sanitary crisis we're pulling out of. And we saw the role of the monetary and the budgetary approaches. But we can think that we will shift when there is this recovery. But we have questions on the rebuilding, and my introduction would be that I think there's a great opportunity to say, and we heard that earlier, what is finance? In fact, finance finance is just a general term, generic term. It's not just private finance or the private financial market. It's a broader system where you have the governments who set the orientations. We have a monetary policies, and then the budgetary and tax measures that go together. And then we have the financial markets who play their roles. We have the prudential systems also that are concentrated on the yield risk ratio, and which essentially, and that's important, and it's this conclusion I think we have to draw from that we haven't drawn since the crisis. There are no orientations. The markets are not oriented. I think that people here are aware of the environmental crisis, social crisis, but I don't think, unfortunately, that they represent the majority of actors on the financial markets. But it's not the role of financial markets to give directions, to set the directions, the orientations, but it's the role of the budgetary policies and tax policies of the governments. And what we could hope is a discussion we should have at the European level. The heads of states are meeting on the 17th, 18th of July in Brussels. They haven't met for several months now, and the essential discussion will be on the recovery plan that was proposed by the European Commission, and that, in fact, includes a strong budgetary investment on behalf of the states and Europe. And this is absolutely key because this dimension of setting the orientations and investments has a stabilizing effect on the whole system, including on the monetary policy. We see that the monetary policy, which is blinded due to a lack of political vision and economic orientation through the budgetary policies. These monetary policies are not very efficient. We see that the recovery is slow in terms of investments, for example. So we think that it's an opportunity, but we'll have to maintain this level of budgetary policy and state investments over several years beyond the period, the firefighting period over several years. And to conclude, yes, you talked about the environmental crisis. The International Energy Agency, in a dense report, states they're talking about 7,000 billion, 7,000 billion, yes. 7 trillion, if you prefer, that will be invested by the states in the coming months, will have an extremely structuring impact on the economy. And if we don't take into account environmental criteria, if you don't line up this investment with the environmental objectives, roughly to make sure that the economy stays within the planet's limit, unfortunately, the answer is brutal. There's a lock-in effect, and it will be too late. Even if in 3 or 4 years at last the states really adopt an ecological or environmental transition, it'll be too late. It's key, even when you talk about stability. It's not just an ecological vision. Well, there's a question from someone who didn't give his name on the orientation and of investments. When it's not oriented, it's not too speculative. For longer projects, should we have pension plan money to invest? What answer would you give to this auditor? François RIAHI and then Philippe Bénédicte. François RIAHI. Now, if we're talking about France, the savings of households have been traditionally oriented towards tax-supported supports, the livret A and life insurance in euros with a capital guarantee. And so with the limits tied to that. And it's true that we have a long-term issue here, investment, taking more risk, because if you invest in enterprises, it does bear risks, and it's limited by this effect. There's also this question related to the information of the investor. There's a demand for more information. Patricia, yes. Well, the question of labels, the labeling is very important. And France has created in 2016 a label on SRIs aimed at the individual investor who doesn't have access to SRI investments. And the label is there to guarantee a good level of information on these products, financial products. So there's a label guaranteeing that it's socially responsible in terms of investment. So it's green. There's the SRI and then the green fee investment also for specifically green products. And it's quite important, you know, individuals are seeking this information and seeking these labels, and we have to promote them. And Philippe DONNET. Well, I think that, in fact, we have all the tools available to manage to orient those savings towards SRI investments, because we have more and more measuring tools. We'll need the pension plans, you know. They exist in Europe. It's life insurance. Life insurance is a form of a pension fund, and it's the capacity to collect long-term savings, enabling to invest in the long term. And long-term investment is not speculative by nature. It can be risky, and not everybody can turn into an investor in private equities. You know, you have to be trained for that, and that's where the professionals play a full role. When it comes to investing your savings, I confirm that our clients are looking for green products. More and more, our clients want to invest responsibly, and they look more carefully where they invest their money. Absolutely. Besides that, the traditional products that Mr. Riyad is proposing, life insurance products, Euro funds, for example, are unfortunately, it's over. You know, it's a world that's going because of very low interest rates, even negative, you know. So we don't know if this environment will continue, but we need to inform the people with savings on what they can invest. And that's why regulations in terms of transparency is very important. Monsieur Lallemand, I have a question that I will also address to Mrs. CRIFO. It's Antoine, an auditor, who would like to have further explanations on the NGFS, the network for greening the financial system. Is it really efficient? So the network of central banks to make the financial systems greener was a network that was set up, I think, a year or two ago, that is handled by the Banque of France. It's efficient. Activities are developing at a growing pace. And it's very good to be there, you know. It's but there's a lot of momentum in terms of discussions. But where we stand today, one of the major reports was a call for action. We're still at the call for action. So in terms of action, the central banks in their monetary or financial supervision functions are slow in taking actions. We do stress tests, we do scenario analysis, but it's still extremely soft, if I may say so. So everything's there, but we have to take action. So can you, what's the NGFS? The NGFS is a network of central banks for the greening of the financial system. It was created in 2017, December, at the One Planet Summit by 8 central banks and supervision banks. So the idea is to make the financial system greener. But are there things, no, concretely, while the Bank of France, Banque de France, and the CPR, the controlling authority, created commission, the climate and sustainable finance institution. The implementation here is, and the objective is to implement the Paris agreements within the central banks and supervisors. And the recommendations, well, the first report was published in April 2019 to use these recommendations and to drive pilots or stress tests to raise the awareness, assess the resilience, the resistance of the financial sector to climate risks. And so it's more than just raising awareness here. It's really taking the Paris agreements and adapting it to the financial sector. I can testify as a bank, you know, we prepare our climate stress tests, It's quite complicated. It's, of course, it's new. We have to define the methodologies, but it's very concrete because the stress test, and well, that's how we manage our risks. That's how we manage our equity. And so Benoit LALLEMAND was right to say that it's just we're at the beginning. So we don't know. There are no definitions of the impacts or on the equity, but we know we're a bank. We're regulated. We know that when we carry out stress tests. So when will well, it's already efficient to a certain extent because to raise the question, or to address the question, is already a step for a bank. The biggest risk is that the transition takes place. We have financing of enterprise that could be impacted in case there is a strong transition. And also to be aware of the risks, to measure them and quantify them is already something that's taking place. Agnès, BENASSY-QUÉRÉ. So generally speaking, there's a greater awareness of supervisors, but also financial institutions, of the risk linked with brown assets that can lose value very rapidly in the years to come. Brown assets, which are in the polluting sector. And so it's normal that we should take measures with a view of these assets that are extremely risky. Independently, even if you have someone that's not necessarily aware of climate change, with a simple analysis of the risk yield, and of course the green stress tests are very important for that. And there's a will to control this risk for the brown assets. Some add that the monetary policies should be greened, and the central bank should refinance in a differential way the assets, whether they're green or brown. So it's true in a certain way, because central bank cannot accept assets that are too risky in its balance sheet, that can lose value very rapidly, so they can't take it in its balance sheet. But needless to say, they'll do it. On the other hand, we can't ask the European Central Bank to do industrial policies to ensure the environment transition. Benoit LALLEMAND was saying earlier, it's not the role of the financial markets. You need an orientation direction. The central bank needs to be oriented. It's not up to them to carry out the transition. So do you agree with that, Benoit LALLEMAND? No, I was just wanting to clarify that. The NGFS. Can you hear me? Okay. So this very good initiative that's going in the right direction. There is progress made, but what I'd like to say, we're a counterweight. We can't say that everything's going well. There is an emergency. There is an urgency when we hear, okay, we're raising questions, we're asking questions, fine, but we have to be realistic before we have the data we need. We talk about stress tests. It's not really stress tests. The Bank of France recognizes this. We analyze scenarios, because if you wanted to do a stress test, you need past data. But there's a very strong uncertainty. We don't know what we'll get. But what else to say? To conclude about the NGFS, if we had a tax policy, in a nutshell, if the heads of states and the French state had a strong ecological transition position, Mrs. Lagarde and Monsieur de Gallo would not have to green their monetary policy. It's their role to align their monetary policies, forget the prudential, but on the general economic trends. They would do that. And Madame Lagarde and the central banks are right to say that it's not up to them to give the direction to the economy. I think it's up to the head of states and politicians.
I have another question from Brian. Wouldn't carbon pricing result in the development of mafias, same way we're seeing in the waste management market? We have observed fraud in the carbon quota markets. With taxes, there is fraud. With the TVA, there is fraud with their checks. But with the development of digital platforms, fraud is being monitored and tracked. Carbon pricing is necessary. The issue of fraud I mean, that's true for any type of mechanism. It's not specific to carbon pricing. We have to watch that, of course, but it's not specific to carbon. There was an issue like that that I heard about recently. We have to be very watchful, indeed. Another question by François. Shouldn't we urgently stop the fiscal dumping legalized by RBO that make governments poorer and jeopardize companies such as Vivarte, Europcar, and Camailleux that are threatening thousands of jobs? Patricia CRIFO and Mr. Donnet. That is a major part of the question of fiscal responsibility. That's among the criteria of the social responsibility of a company. It is part of the criteria. It's a governance issue. The Forum pour l'investissement responsable issued a note recently on this subject. It is indeed one of the criteria. The fiscal responsibility or where the company pays their tax in relation to where the activity is carried out. That is one of the dimensions of corporate responsibility. Philippe Donnet from Generali. When we talk about LBOs and private equity, that's a way of investing that's geared on the longer term than listed companies. The average period of holding of listed companies' shares is very short. We're seeing that value creation by private companies that are held by long-term investment funds is much longer than for listed companies. That being said, there are some LBOs that don't unfold well because there was too much debt, because business didn't go well. There are examples in LBOs too. Responsible investment, meaning without drowning companies in debt, has many virtues in terms of value creation. There are questions on this helicopter money. A question by Robin. Quantitative easing has been widely used. This time, it's not banks that are threatened, but it's the real economy. Why shouldn't we distribute this brand new created money to SMEs and to citizens? Well, first, I'd like to talk about the ECB and why it's not doing anything else that it's doing today. What it's doing today, it is purchasing assets from banks, and it's paying with central bank money, liquidity. And that's the purse that banks are going to use to pay back their debts and to deal with their clients and to loan more money to their clients. Why doesn't the central bank lend money directly to businesses and households? Why? Well, first, households and SMEs do not hold an account at the central bank. So it's very complicated. When the central bank buys bonds or public bonds, it will credit the account that that bank holds at the central bank. So it's really fast. That's the first reason. The second reason is that the ECB doesn't know who needs that money, so it will credit both the accounts of super rich people and to people who are struggling. So it's the government that knows who needs the money. The third reason is that it's not the mandate of the ECB. It's not elected. It's not up to the central bank to redistribute money and to decide to pick those that need liquidity, that need cash. The ECB has one target, which is ensuring price stability and in the service of growth and transition, because that's another objective of the European Union. Finally, this helicopter money deal would mean that the ECB would accumulate in its balance sheet assets that worth nothing, since they will never be reimbursed. That's fine, but if one day interest rates raise, then they will have to pay interest on that. So that means recurrent losses. So you might say, why not? Because it will never go bankrupt, but it has to create money to pay this interest. So this will raise inflation. So we would be back in the inflationary spiral. Or if it cannot create money, it will ask for money to the government. So more taxes. So the conclusion of all this is that we have to leave monetary policy to the ECB, and we need to do the budgetary policy, fiscal policy, develop the European budget and the current mandates of the European Community. Benoit, you're at Finance Watch. What is your view on the role of the ECB? Well, helicopter money sounds like a very good idea, but, well, the most important things were already said, so I won't repeat it. But if you want to help the most disadvantaged people or the SMEs, well, that's for budget policy of the government or tax policy of the government. This is the reason why we would like to have a real post-crisis conversation on how the economy is organized. There seems to be a kind of taboo. We have been in the past 20 years in a taboo situation where police. It's the only way to go. We could ask the central bank for helicopter money, but it's much easier for governments to do it. Again, on green finance, we're very much involved in all of this. All of this is going on at European level, and all of this is very useful, but we should not be wrong. It would have a mechanical effect. It would on financial markets who are focusing on the relationship between yield and risk, and it would alter this. And of course, we have to take into account social justice. Budget policy is not just, or tax policy is not just about a carbon tax. There's also redistribution issues. Benoit Lallemand, do you believe that the European Council that will be held mid-July, do you think that they have taken a growing awareness? Yes, indeed. Yes, I can tell you that based on the text put forth by the Commission, there is a huge ambition. For example, aligning this on the European Green Deal. We talk about the European Green Deal a lot in Brussels, but not so much in government, in countries. As a citizen, I can say that people say Brussels, Brussels, it's all bad. The reality is that member states do not really want to become involved in the Green Deal or an environmental revolution. Why? Well, for many reasons. Oh, well, yeah, we don't really need electric batteries. Well, there's also a matter of time frame. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen and there's no intention, but we are far from the mark in terms of rapidity of ambition. Yes, I totally agree with what Benoit Lallemand just said. The more signals we have, the more directions provided by public authorities, such as the Green Deal, which is a great example, and the better the financial community will be in a position to respond to these signals and align their capital and will align with their policies. So we're still doing it, even though we do not have the signals such as carbon pricing, but it would be faster and more efficient if we had those signals. Patricia, 10 seconds. Yes, I totally agree with you. We absolutely need those signals. Oh, Agnès BENASSY-QUÉRÉ, you can conclude. 10 seconds too. Well, there was a strong consensus around this table and across the screens on the question of finance. And we've gone a long way since the last crisis. At that time, finance was the problem, and now we're looking to finance for a solution. And governments tend to be like hiding behind the central bank or finance to solve the energy problems. Thank you to all of you for taking part to this debate.